Snow muted the sound of engines, but it couldn't hide the rhythm of a halted column. The vehicles stood in a long, uneven line along a Belgian road, antennae iced over, exhaust turning to pale fog and drifting sideways. Officers moved briskly with maps tucked under their arms. Somewhere in the middle of that line, where the snow had been trampled into a dark ribbon, a junior officer cracked open a small, brown, waterproof carton. It was the size of a hardcover book and weighed less than a canteen. The label, efficient font, simple instructions, said all a cold, hungry person needed to know. Breakfast, individual, ready now. The lid peeled away with a muted rasp. Inside, a tidy geography of confidence. A can of chopped ham and egg, a chocolate bar wrapped in foil that reflected the pale daylight, for cigarettes with their paper pristine, a paper envelope of instant coffee that promised warmth without waiting, sugar tablets, chewing gum, a folded square of tissue, a paper matchbook, a short wooden spoon, a tiny can opener that felt like it could outlast the winter. The officer passed pieces to the men around him. They ate quietly, each taste producing a small pause, a moment where the road, the cold, and the thin grey horizon faded and something like normal life returned. Even that modest wooden spoon told a story. A factory far away, a train, a ship, a warehouse, a truck, a depot, a clerk with a rubber stamp marking a date barely 2 months old. Fresh enough that the paper still had a smell. One box on a roadside would be a curiosity. Thousands in a depot were a statement. And when you realize each soldier opened 3 of these boxes in a day, the statement becomes a calculation. How many boxes to feed a division? How many divisions in a theater? How many theaters at once? Each carton was more than food. It was a receipt for a continent's worth of planning. The column wasn't stopped for a picnic. It was stopped because engines drink more than people eat. The morning's fuel had been taken from captured supplies in a previous town, cans carried hand to hand, 5 gallons at a time, pouring into steel throats until the spouts rattled. That stock had been a windfall, big numbers chalked on a clipboard, enough to move the needle west. But the line on the map ahead, Stavelot, was supposed to be better, a major fuel point, according to intelligence. Reach it quickly, top off everyone, push for the river crossings. It was the kind of plan that works if time behaves and roads cooperate. Time was not cooperating. Bridges needed checks. Every culvert might be wired. Every bend could hide a gun crew with a field of fire and a triggerman whose fingers still had feeling. Frost made rubber slick. Refugees pulled wagons across intersections and stared without speaking. And above it all was a practical truth. Even the most formidable vehicle becomes sculpture when the gauge reads empty. 2 staff officers conferred at the hood of a vehicle with its engine idling unevenly. The older one had the map that intelligence had marked days earlier. Thick pencil circles on towns, arrows where someone expected progress to be as straight as a chalk line. He tapped the symbol for Stavelot. There, he said, as if pointing at an answer in the back of a mathematics book. Fuel in quantity. The younger one nodded, but his eyes drifted to the small mountain of brown cartons stacked neatly against a wall. He pocketed a stick of chewing gum. You couldn't pocket gasoline. The road out of the current town ran beside a river and then into a hard right through narrow streets. Steel tracks laid clean lines through powder. Men on foot left dimpled patterns that filled slowly with new snowflakes. They moved under a sky the color of a kit bag, and as the column crept along, the presence of neatness kept asserting itself, American neatness. Labels, stencils, standardized boxes, standard spouts and standard caps. Nothing improvised unless it was intentionally so. Even the waste looked organized. Empty tins stacked by size, spent wooden crates collapsed and tied with twine, discarded paper in bundles. The difference between we made enough and we made do is a texture you can see without needing to read a single report. They paused at a crossroads where a signpost leaned, names thoroughly familiar and abruptly foreign. Ahead should be the depot. The officers spread out, scouting with binoculars, squinting at yards and warehouses. They expected tanks with pipes and fences, fuel farms with big tanks, official gates, a certain silhouette. When you grow up inside a system, you imagine other systems look like yours. The search pattern reflected that assumption. Check the freight yard, check the works yard, check the factory lot, check the obvious. Men waited by vehicles and ate chocolate slowly to stretch the moment. The coffee melted into canteen lids and steam briefly turned them into people at a stove in a kitchen. Even the cigarettes, rationed to 4 per box, felt like proof that somewhere, someone had not only counted every person but planned to give each one a small comfort. A private tucked his matchbook inside his glove. It was too nice to waste. Movement resumed. The column rolled over a bridge that should have been a handful of smoke and rising sparks. Instead, the charges had failed. A blessing like that usually brings trouble tucked in behind it. The lead vehicles reached the far side and fanned into the western streets, engines low, watchers posted at corners. The map said fuel lived nearby. The eyes said otherwise. You cannot supply a major offensive from thin air and wishful thinking. If the depot existed, it ought to announce itself, humming with engines, busy with handlers, or at minimum marked by rows of infrastructure. It was not there. The search broadened. Courtyards, rail spurs, yards behind workshops. What they found was ordinary: a few scattered cans, remnants in sheds, small caches in alleys. Useful, yes, but not major. The kind of finds you celebrate with a nod, not a cheer. The map's confidence had outrun the road's reality. The day, like the fuel, began to thin. A pragmatic voice won out: move while you can, turn quantity into distance, trust that the next town's reality will match the map's promises. The engines revved grudgingly. Men flicked away cigarettes with the discipline of people who had learned that smoke can tell stories to those who can read it. The neat stacks of ration cartons on the captured depot floor were left behind for others in the tail of the column. No one wanted to be the last vehicle, because the last vehicle is what a road swallows when it tightens. As they rolled out of the town and onto the countryside road that angled north of the river, the younger officer glanced left. Nothing but a snow-lined verge and a gentle row of bare hedges. On the far side of those hedges, not far, the road ran straight for a stretch. He reached for the binoculars, then thought better of it and focused forward. He had bridges to worry about, and men who needed him to think strictly in the next 15 minutes. The column passed within shouting distance of a line of 5-gallon cans that stretched farther than a winter sprint. They were stacked in waist-high walls along the road. No fences, no pipes, no chimneys, no watchtowers, just fuel set where it could be reached quickly and carried anywhere. Neat stencils faced outward, dates fresh, caps aligned, a long green statement in the vocabulary of speed. The officers did not see it because they were not looking for the grammar of abundance written in lower case. They drove by, hunting for a capital letter depot that never appeared. On the western edge of the town, the column paused again to let a team check the road ahead for obstructions. It gave the staff a minute to take stock. In a windowless room that smelled faintly of dust and motor oil, 2 maps lay side by side, the operational sheet with sweeping arrows and a smaller, more honest sketch showing bridges, gradients, and fuel burn per kilometre for each vehicle type. The chief of the advance guard did the arithmetic that always tells the truth. At the current pace, even with careful throttle and no detours, the spearhead could reach the next objective only by shaving comfort and ignoring contingencies. The reserve cans strapped to racks were promises you make to yourself for later. Later was dissolving. Someone brought in a stack of those same small boxes. The breakfast units were followed by the lunch versions with cheese in the can and biscuits that held together when dipped in coffee. The wooden spoons tapped light sounds on metal lids. It was impossible not to notice how each carton was a tiny toolbox of predictability. You opened it and your next 15 minutes were solved. Eat, drink, light a cigarette, wipe your hands, and there is even a match or two left for the evening. Nothing inside required a field kitchen or a specialist. Nothing inside asked the weather for permission. Open, consume, move. Look at the date, one sergeant said, turning the can to show the stamp. The ink hadn't faded. Someone had filled that can when the leaves were still on the trees, sent it across an ocean, and placed it within reach here, now, on a day when breath smoked in the air. This was not a warehouse being emptied of old stock. It was a steady flow. That understanding does something quiet to morale, on both sides. Outside, a scout returned with a short report. Minor obstacles, some shell craters frozen into bowls, no sign of a large installation. The bridge ahead was intact. He added, almost as an afterthought, that there were rows of cans behind a hedgerow north of the approach road out beyond where the column had just come through. How many? Someone asked. The scout made a face you make when a number feels ridiculous. Enough to look like a wall, he said, then clarified. Not in the town, not guarded, not fenced. The reply drew a skeptical shrug. Fuel that mattered would be guarded, fenced, signed, counted. You do not leave treasure on the roadside like firewood. The column rolled again. As tracks clattered onto the next stretch, the landscape widened. Fields pressed flat by weather, trees spaced like metronomes, a distant church tower that watched the road without comment. The air was perfectly still. Winter can do that. Turn sound into a slow thing. The vehicles sounded farther away than they were. In all that quiet, the hum of an engine on reserve felt louder than an argument. Ahead, in a modest square, the crew of a stalled half-track bent over a pump borrowed from a captured depot. They were teaching the American jerrycan to mate with a German tank port, a mismatch they had already solved twice today. The can's stamp handle, the spout's thread, the way the cap tethered itself with a small chain, everything about it was made to be used by someone wearing gloves in cold weather. You try a thing once and understand whether a designer had imagined the person who would depend on it. The men nodded while they worked. Whoever made this had imagined them. The staff officer who had been doing arithmetic earlier rechecked his totals. He kept one finger pressed to a number that bothered him, the consumption curve if the weather switched and the road softened. Snow turning to slush multiplies fuel burn as surely as an uphill grade. He didn't need a lecture about weather. He needed gallons. The map suggested following the main route. His gut suggested skirting, testing side roads for something like a miracle, anything that smelled like another stockpile. He raised the idea. The senior officer shook his head. Time was the enemy they could do nothing about, and side roads can steal hours. They pushed on. The river stayed cold and black to the left, sliding between stone embankments into cuttings where the ice skimmed thin and fragile over eddies. Bridges ahead had the tired look of things that had done honest work longer than anyone intended. Every time an engineer waved a flag for clear, there was a moment of breath held collectively and then the release of engines rolling over wood and stone. On the far side, each time, the relief was bargain basement, temporary and not nearly enough. The road climbed gently. On the crest, the sky widened and the wind arrived from nowhere, carrying a smell of damp wood and faint petroleum, the ghost of a depot they hadn't found. It was the smell of almost. The junior officer lifted the binoculars now, sweeping the far lines where hedges turned to fence posts and fence posts turned to nothing. He noticed regular shapes out in a field north of the road, stacked in a way that wasn't natural. He lowered the glasses to check the path under the tracks and looked up again. The shapes had vanished into the general geometry of winter. Snow and discipline can make abundance blend in. They entered a village whose square looked like a shelf. One side held a bakery with its windows blacked, another a garage with the doors half closed, the third a small shed with a neat pyramid of wood. A door opened and closed quickly when the first vehicle crossed. You could imagine the interior warmth like a story you once heard and want to hear again. The column did not stop. If you stop for warmth, you lose light, and the day loses interest in you faster than you think. A captured radio in the lead car crackled with fragments of an English language net. Standardized words, standardized times, unit names that sounded like sports teams, clear and sharp and almost cheerful. Schedules ran like rails under their voices. Behind that chatter, you could hear an entire invisible machine moving. Trucks departing depots by the hundreds, ships unloading in a port with cranes that never slept, trains rolling on rails that weren't crated, repair shops with spare parts in bins where a clerk could locate a carburetor by reaching 3 bins to the left without looking. The voices weren't bragging. They were just doing their jobs. By mid-afternoon, the light began to thin, turning the snow from white to a kind of chalky grey. You could feel the decision tree squeeze, press ahead with the gauge hovering meanly, or halt and try to scrape a few more gallons from the roadside. Small caches, scattered cans in sheds, odd barrels rolled from places where people had hidden them months before. Pressing ahead promised momentum. Scraping promised certainty but bled time. The senior officer decided in favor of momentum. "We will make Bridgehead by dusk," he said, and tapped the map where the river turned like a hinge. The man who loved arithmetic purely as arithmetic did not argue. He wrote the time and the estimated burn in pencil and underlined the word dusk. The vehicles climbed once more. The river fell away and left them on a ridge. The wind returned carrying a new scent, distant exhaust, not their own. People listened without moving their heads. Familiarity with engines breeds a sixth sense. You can tell friendly from unfamiliar by cadence and pitch. This sound was light, quick, well-tuned. It came and went. Somewhere out there, someone else's timetable ran on time. When they dropped off the ridge and snaked through another stand of bare trees, the road angled lower than the fields. Hedge and bank rose on either side into shallow snow walls that were exactly tall enough to hide anything waist-high. The column slowed for a corner. 20 seconds off the left, stacked in clean lines taller than a man, ran fuel in 5-gallon bricks, side by side, end to end, aligned like the pages of a book laid on their edges. The paint was unchipped, the stencils crisp. No sentry walked that line because the best guard is reach and repetition. When you can replace a thing easily, you don't waste people protecting it like treasure in a vault. You leave it where it is and expect to fetch it when needed. They never turned their heads. At the far end of the trees, a small team waved them down to check a crossroads. The men on that team had pockets full of American sugar tablets and faces that showed the small lift sugar gives after hours of cold work. One of them, still chewing, mentioned casually to the arithmetic officer that he'd seen a strange fence of cans earlier in the day, out past the bend, stacked too neatly to be farm stores. The officer nodded without absorbing the weight of it. His brain was currently balancing fuel, darkness, and the need to secure a line before night. He made a note anyway, in a small book whose pages had grown crowded with emergencies. Behind all of this, the quiet logic of those brown cartons kept asserting itself. In a place where big problems wore uniforms and made noise, the little boxes solved small problems silently. A clean spoon when hands were numb, a strip of tissue when the wind cut, a match that worked the first time. Good logistics starts with respect for details you can hold. You feed a person well, and you shorten the time between cold and ready. You do that millions of times, and roads begin to feel shorter. The column rolled on. One vehicle sputtered, recovered, then settled into a thin, strained note. The driver glanced at the gauge and pretended not to see it. The passenger found another cigarette in his pocket and pretended it was a celebration. The road ahead bent toward a village with a church where the bell rope must have frozen into a stiff line. The clock face showed a time that did not match anyone's watch. In war, every clock lies in its own way. Dusk arrived exactly as predicted by the pencil. The river crossings waited with their own arithmetic, angles of approach, fields of view, and how many engines could idle before a hesitation became a halt. Somewhere far behind, a depot clerk, in a place not touched by snow, stamped dates on boxes and stacked them on pallets. He did not know he was participating in a story that would be told by the light of cigarettes held in cup hands on a road lined with hedges. He only knew that the stamp needed to be straight and the ink re-inked after a certain number of impressions. Systems stay systems because someone cares about small things. Night was an hour away. The road narrowed. The men leaned forward slightly in their seats, as if their bodies could lend weight to the engine's wish to continue. And the younger officer, the one who liked details, finally wrote a single line on his notebook under the word dusk. If the enemy can set a meal on a schedule, perhaps they can set gasoline on a schedule. Look for that. He underlined it. Then he closed the book as the lead vehicle braked for the first checkpoint at the river. The bridge felt too narrow for steel, but the first vehicle edged onto it anyway, tracks clicking where timber met iron bolts. White breath from the river rose to blur the far bank. Engineers crouched low with lanterns hooded, watching how boards flexed, counting the seconds between each axle. When the last car reached the midpoint, the senior officer looked down at his glove and found a faint grease stain from the American pump they'd used that morning. He rubbed it absent-mindedly as if it were a smudge on a lens. On the far side, the column fanned into a defensive arc just long enough to send small teams ahead through doorways and courtyards. Each search turned up the same mixed picture: order and absence. Storerooms lined with labeled shelves, dates recent, content sensible. Then empty racks where the best items had already moved onward. The Americans seemed to believe in moving things forward as far as possible and leaving little behind but the idea of what had been there. Signs, checklists, templates pinned to walls, unload here, stack by lot, record temperature. You can learn a stranger's habits by reading the notes they leave to themselves. A squad pride open a wooden crate stamped with a code and a month. Inside, nested can shine like coins in a fountain. The men tuck them into packs until straps squeaked. A corporal, no longer young, weighed a can of coffee concentrate in his palm the way a mechanic weighs a new tool. Appreciative, almost protective. He did not drink it. He slipped it into his coat as if saving some of this order for later might improve a different road on a different day. Beyond the square, the road climbed again through houses with curtains hanging still. Someone's front step held a child's metal pail turned upside down, snow starting to cap it, making it look like a small domed monument to ordinary life. The column's pace had settled into that careful speed between urgency and overreach, a tempo learned only by people who have run out of things and then regretted sprinting. At a T-junction, a guide panel had been knocked askew. The engineer lieutenant knelt, brushed off snow, and found underneath a stencil meant for drivers, a simple arrow system showing where to peel off for fuel, bulk, and where to turn for fuel, packaged. The paint was bright, not sun-faded. He stood, pointed with 2 fingers. They use both, he said. Pipes and cans. The senior officer nodded and gave the signal to move. He filed the thought away with the dozens of other useful facts that arrived too late to change the day you're in. Then came contact, brief, sharp, like a match struck and snuffed. A pair of guns at a crossroads, shield plates white with frost, crew quick and practiced. The lead vehicles halted, slewed, and returned fire. Snow popped and hissed where fragments skidded. The sound was a lesson. Every stop is a chance for someone else to set terms. It took 5 minutes to unteach that lesson with speed and smoke. When the road was theirs again, a messenger from the rear jogged forward with a small crate in his arms, almost smiling. More of those boxes, he announced, as though he'd brought new shoes. They took a short break under eaves where the snow didn't settle and opened the supper units, biscuits again, a tin of meat, drink powder that turned canteen water into something warmer than it began. The junior officer read the instruction slip not because he needed it but because it met his mood. Tiny printed certainty. Heat not required, it said. Consume as is. He chewed and looked at the vehicles. Mud frozen on track shoes, black outlines forming where snow had kissed metal and melted. Everything wore a border. Notice the can, the engineer lieutenant said, flipping a captured 5-gallon by its triple handle with a smooth roll. Internal baffle. Doesn't slosh. You can pour with one hand and hold with the other. He rapped the side where 3 embossed letters rose like a signature of a language no one argued with anymore. Cap has a clamp, not threads. Even with gloves, you feel it shut. He didn't say the rest, but everyone saw it. Design that imagines cold hands, numb fingertips, low light. Hurry. When they moved again, the radio net from the other side returned as a faint trellis they could hear through. Calls and acknowledgements, short and consistent. It was not only the words. It was the pacing. 3 seconds on, 3 seconds off, a metered confidence. Someone far away was keeping every piece on tempo, and that tempo made bridges seem less like obstacles and more like marks on a staff. The river turned, and with it the road. The arithmetic officer opened his notebook and drew a small graph. Distance down, fuel remaining across, marked the current point, drew a line to a probable one. He did it without drama, the way a doctor looks at a fever chart and decides whether to add another blanket or ask a different question. We cross a threshold in 40 minutes, he told the senior officer. After that, choices narrow. A runner returned with news from a scouting pair that had pushed farther north on foot. Nothing like a tank farm, he reported. Only walls of cans, along the verge, farther than you can count quickly. No guards seen. He delivered it with the same tone as reporting a weather change. The senior officer asked for distances, landmarks, features. The runner shrugged, gestured vaguely toward the hedges and a farm lane that looked like every other farm lane in winter. Beyond the bend, he said. Past a line of poplars. They did not turn back. Past mid-afternoon, fatigue began to show in the smallest ways, in how men climbed down from vehicles, in how orders had to be repeated once or twice to be sure they landed. One driver shook his hands out after holding the wheel tight for hours and looked for a moment at the bone-white knuckles as if they belonged to someone else. The small luxuries in the cartons, gum, a square of chocolate saved for last, stretched not because the men feared running out, but because pause itself felt like a resource. They reached the next bridge with less light than they wanted and more calm than they expected. The chargers wired along the abutments were still there, still attached to their metal boxes, lids open, the contents missing. Someone had left a pair of pliers on the stone. Fate can be personal like that. It leaves behind the shape of its decision. On the west side of the crossing, the town they had to pass through announced itself with a smell of burned wood and a curtain of grey hanging under the rooftops. The streets were narrow, the buildings close, the windows mostly dark. The lead vehicles slowed to a whisper. Every house became a possible sentence, and every window was a clause that might end in a period you didn't like. Foot teams moved ahead at the pace of thought, quick but careful, anger held in a pocket with the cold. In the midst of that tension, another depot appeared, not large, not central, but telling. Stacks of replacement parts, sealed tins of lubricant with spouts that folded flat, cartons of gloves with sizes printed plainly on the sides. The quartermaster among them lit up like someone seeing family. He lifted a set of fan belts and read the code aloud. Fits half our fleet, he said, and kissed the box with his mitten. Standardization is a quiet kind of kindness. They took what they could carry without breaking the fragile rhythm of movement. A man who had been silent all day found his voice when he looked at a pile of cardboard tubes labeled for medical use, bandages wrapped so that even a hurried hand could find the end and start the wrap without fumbling. He had served at an aid station months earlier and still remembered the feel of reusing cloth that should have been thrown away. He slid 2 tubes into his coat and tapped them twice like a promise. By early evening, they had worked past the worst of the constriction and out into a broader lane that the map claimed would lead to open country again. Snow began to fall in a new, small way, flex-like punctuation over every surface. In the last light, the arithmetic officer drew a circle on his graph and wrote, "Here," then shaded it lightly. It was the point beyond which all plans become hopes unless someone steals a solution from the margins. He snapped the notebook shut and looked up at a sign at the lane's mouth. The letters were plain. Someone had painted over them once and painted them again when the names changed hands the prior season. He thought briefly about names themselves, the way they stay while everything else moves. Then he put on his glove, checked his watch, and climbed back onto the running board, throwing an arm around a handhold that had warmed slightly from use. Behind them, north of the hedges and the farm lane beyond the bend past the line of poplars, the rows of cans waited in the careful formation of an army that never tired. The snow gave them rounded shoulders and then took them away under the faintest wind. An American driver might stop there in the dark with a flashlight that worked even in cold and count off 10 for you, 10 for you, and drive on. The neatness would remain, the wall would lower, and the road elsewhere would feel shorter again. Ahead, the senior officer pointed to a dark hill that scratched at the sky. "That ridge," he said, and then the turn toward our night line. It sounded like an ordinary instruction on an ordinary day. The junior officer, chewing the last piece of gum from his box, answered with an ordinary understood, then tucked the wrapper, still smelling faintly of mint, into his pocket. It was the smallest superstition in a day made of large arithmetic. If you save the wrapper, maybe the road saves you a little time. Snow softened the world into 2 colors, road and not road. The convoy used the contrast as a guide more than any map now, following the grey ribbon where tires had pressed earlier in the day. In the cab of the third vehicle, a driver kept time by humming a tune he barely remembered from a peacetime cafe, keeping his foot steady, matching the rhythm to the gentle surge of the engine. When the radio clicked alive with a short code, 2 syllables, a pause, a number, he turned the volume down a notch so he could feel it more than hear it. It was enough to know the line still breathed. They reached the ridge at the hour when sky and snow exchanged light like partners trading a coat. The lead scouts paused at the crest, silhouettes outlined, then dipped down the far side and returned with a hand signal that meant, simply, continue. Beyond the ridge, the land opened into long fields edged by windbreaks. Somewhere out there lay the larger road that would angle them toward the river valley and the night position marked earlier with a pencil circle and a quiet here. On the slope, they found another sign of a different system at work, a set of timber pallets stacked in perfect squares, each with stenciled codes, still tied with webbing. The quartermaster knelt and tugged free a loose strap end with his gloves. "Drop zone method," he said, almost to himself. "Build once, scatter many, assemble anywhere." The pallets held items that seemed designed for tired hands, canvas water bags with wide mouths and wire stays that clipped open, lanterns with guards that protected glass from hasty elbows, a roll of numbered tickets for ration lines, printed in alternating colors so a clerk could check sequence at a glance. Nothing looked improvised. Everything looked pre-decided. A runner jogged up from the column center with an update on consumption. "We are into the reserve cans," he said, patting the side of the nearest 5-gallon, "but we are still ahead of the slope." The arithmetic officer nodded once, grateful for the choice of words. In his notebook, the slant of ink had begun to shallow. Hearing another voice use the same metaphor made the page feel less lonely. They cleared the last hedgerow and found the wind stronger on the flats. It carried a smell of cold iron and distant smoke, not threatening so much as constant. The senior officer called a halt and let the engines idle while he and the engineer lieutenant walked ahead to a slight rise where they could view the coming turns. Up close, the engineer's observations turned into small lectures. Notice the way their culverts are braced with board and gravel, fast to build, hard to wash out. He sketched the cross-section with a gloved finger in the snow. You build this way when you assume heavy traffic for a long time. You don't do this for a 1-week road. The road bent left around a cluster of low barns. There they met a group of civilians walking in the opposite direction, bundled in coats and carrying bundles in silence. One elderly man lifted 2 fingers from his hat brim, a gesture that was neither welcome nor rejection, merely acknowledgement of a shared winter. A child pulled a small sled with a square of folded fabric tied on top. It might have been a blanket. It might have been something someone could not leave. The convoy gave them room. and for a moment the only sound was the easy hiss of runners. Past the barns, a narrow lane branched north. The scout sergeant raised his hand, asking permission to check it. The senior officer hesitated, glanced at the notebook, then shook his head. The mission line pulled him forward like a taut wire. There is always one lane you do not take, and later it becomes a story. They made better time on the highway, which felt wider simply because the ditches had been cleared. White-painted posts appeared at intervals like metronomes, each with a reflective tab that threw back a pin's worth of light from the vehicle's covered lamps. The junior officer rode for a while with his window cracked open, listening to the difference between a healthy engine and one that asked for care, tiny changes at throttle, the way a belt might note its opinion. He had a feel for machines taught by cold garages and careful mentors, and he knew the sound of an engine that would turn all night if allowed and then complain at dawn. He made a note to swap two vehicles' positions before the next steep grade. At a hamlet marked by a church with a square tower, they stopped long enough to let the infantrymen stretch and stamp their boots. A small store had its door ajar and its shelves half full of paper goods, brown sacks, twine, string tags. The quartermaster exchanged 3 words with the proprietor, left coins on the counter, and emerged with a box of twine that looked like it had been waiting for him for a month. He distributed links to the troops, and suddenly rifles had better slings. Tarps had surer knots. One man fashioned a loop with a quick sailor's hitch to hang a canteen where a strap had frayed. Small fixes make large journeys quiet. They found their night line just before full dark at the edge of a low orchard, branches holding pale loads that crumbled at a touch. Engines went silent one by one like lamps being turned down in a boarding house. Voices grew smaller. The cook truck, really just a canvas and a sensible burner, produced a broth that smelled of onion and patience. Men cupped tins and warmed fingers while steam wrote quick messages that vanished above their heads. Out of habit more than hunger, a few opened one more carton from the captured stack. Inside, everything was where a sleepy hand would expect to find it. You could issue this with your eyes shut, someone said, not unkindly. The engineer lieutenant unfolded a map on the hood of a vehicle and set an enamel cup on each corner. Tomorrow we pivot here, he said, tapping a bridge drawn as 2 thin lines, and then, another tap, we meet the larger road cutting north-south. The senior officer traced the same route with the back of his pencil and looked again at the small circle the arithmetic officer had drawn earlier in the day. It sat slightly to the west of their current place. He thought of all the distances that feel small on a sheet and long with snow underfoot. They set watches and made a rule about lights. Quick, shielded, necessary. Sleep arrived in fragments, 10 minutes at a time, then 30, then an hour. In a nearby barn, someone found a length of clean straw and fashioned a rough mat for the radio set. Insulation, the operator said with professional pride, patting the coils. He wrapped his headphones in a scarf to keep them warm, the way a musician might keep an instrument from losing its tune. Around midnight, the sky cleared. Stars appeared with that winter intensity that makes each one seem closer than it is. The junior officer took his turn walking the line and checked gloves and scarves with the same attention he gave to bolts and pins. At one foxhole, he found the team quietly comparing 2 pocket knives, one from home, worn smooth by years, another from a captured toolkit, edges square and new. They weren't deciding which was better. They were trading stories attached to each. He stopped by the quartermaster's top, where the man sat up making lists by the light of a shaded lamp. I used to work in a warehouse, the quartermaster said with a half smile. When you have enough stock, your job is to put it close to where it will be needed and get out of the way. When you don't, your job is to invent systems that make up for the lack. I think about that every time I open one of their boxes. Their system assumes plenty and saves people's energy. Ours assumes shortage and uses people's energy to fill the gap. He tore the page neatly along a crease and tucked the duplicate under a clip. Both can work. Only one forgives mistakes. Before dawn, the radio brought weather, a window of brighter hours and then clouds again by evening. The senior officer took that as permission to plan ambitiously for the morning and modestly for the afternoon. He gathered his lieutenants and assigned segments like a foreman parceling out work, 2 to the bridge, 1 to the high ground overlooking the bend, another to ride herd on the slowest vehicles so the line would not stretch and snap. They rolled at first light into a world that had sharpened overnight. The air had that bite that encourages people to move briskly. Tools felt clean in the hand. Even the snow squeaked under boots in a tone that promised traction. An abandoned truck stood by the road. It would open, a blanket folded on the seat as if expecting the driver's return. In its bed were 2 crates labeled with tidy stencils: heater, tent, portable, 12 each. The engineer lieutenant examined one, appreciating the small exhaust elbow and the way the fuel line coupler clicked on with confidence. Heat extends work hours, he murmured, almost to himself. Heat is capacity. They approached the bridge with caution and found, to their relief, that the boards were freshly braced in places with nails that still shone. Whoever had crossed last had thought about those who would follow. As the vehicles crept over the span, the arithmetic officer looked down at the water and made another quiet calculation. At this flow, there would be no ice strong enough for months. Bridges would decide all routes. He made a note to retrace their outbound path later and mark each crossing's character: stone, timber, double lane, single lane, repairable, replaceable. Logistics is not one thing. It is a series of next steps that keep you from stopping. Beyond the bridge, a long straight carried them toward a village where the road forked. On the central green, they found a scene that might have been arranged for a training manual: fuel cans in 3 rows, by type and grade, a chalkboard with times and destinations, a clipboard hanging from a nail with carbon paper still under the top sheet.
No guards.
No staff. Only the idea of a system waiting to be resumed. The men looked around for the person in charge and, finding none, worked as if they had been expected. Counted, sorted, moved, left the place neater than found. When they were done, the chalkboard carried 2 new entries in tidy block letters, and the clipboard held a precise tally with signatures. Order is contagious. As they pulled away, the junior officer tucked a small paper into his pocket, an instruction card for using the stove cartridges manufactured an ocean away. Step 1, Step 2, Step 3. He thought about the chain of hands that had made this possible: the planner who wrote the requirement, the designer who chose a thread pitch that would not jam when cold, the worker who tightened the last screw, the driver who placed the crate by the road. None of them knew this village. All of them were present in it. Toward midday, they saw contrails high above, thin seams stitched across blue cloth. A memory rose unbidden of warm air and harvest and the smell of cut hay. The junior officer shook it off and concentrated on distance again. The arithmetic officer's line had flattened further. The slope was gentle now, and the circle from the previous day felt behind them. He allowed himself one luxury. He pressed a fresh piece of gum between his teeth and folded the wrapper into a tiny square he slid under the notebook's elastic. The column slowed for a junction where 3 roads met and no sign told which mattered. The senior officer stepped down, looked at the ruts, and chose the track with the heaviest imprint heading west. Assume mass, he said to no one in particular. The heaviest road is the one most used. The most used road is the one that leads to the next depot. It was a simple thought, and it served them well. By afternoon, the light went brassy and the clouds returned as promised. The road climbed into low hills dotted with pines, and the wind took on that hollow tone it has in stands of trees. They passed a long fence line where someone had looped spare wire into tidy coils every 10 posts. The engineer lieutenant pointed and said, "That's how you keep future repairs easy." He did not elaborate. He didn't have to. Everyone's boots had found loose ends on bad days before. They topped the last rise before the valley and finally saw it, a line of vehicles on the far highway, moving perpendicular to their course in steady intervals, each keeping respectful distance, each carrying something that mattered. For a moment, the senior officer simply watched the flow and measured time between gaps. It is one thing to suspect your opponent's capacity. It is another to see it, labeled, fueled, and right on schedule. He lifted his hand, and the whistle at his lips made a single, contained note. The column tightened, the scouts fanned, and the map on the hood waited for a new pencil mark. The arithmetic officer glanced at his chart, drew a small triangle where line met axis, and wrote one word next to it: pivot. Then he clicked his pencil closed and slid it into the notebook spine. It was time to stop drawing and start moving again. They reached the valley floor by mid-afternoon and felt the temperature lift a degree, just enough to make breath look less like smoke. At the junction, the scouts pushed through a stand of alder and came back with news that sounded like luck. A distribution point, quiet now, but laid out with such care that walking into it felt like entering a well-run workshop after hours. No fences, no guard towers, just a rectangle of order printed onto open ground. Pallets stood in rows like pages in a ledger. Each had a stencil at eye level: unit, date, contents, weight. Colored slashes ran across the corners: blue for fuel accessories, red for food, green for medical, yellow for tools. A board on 2 trestles showed the morning's plan in tidy columns. Next to it, a metal rack held clipboards with carbon sets, the top page marked received, the second issued. The sight pulled a small sound out of the quartermaster, half relief, half professional respect. He adjusted his cap and stepped into the pattern like a tailor reaching for chalk. The first open crate was a breakfast unit. The cardboard felt waxed against damp. Inside, everything was nested within paper sleeves that slid free without tearing. A can with a key, a packet of biscuits that broke cleanly rather than crumbled, crystals that turned into coffee without a fight, a small rectangle of something sweet, a tiny book of matches, a folded square of tissue, 2 sticks of gum. Nothing heavy, nothing fussy, nothing that required a pan, a flame, or spare minutes. A corporal turned the can's key with a sound that triggered appetite. When the lid gave way, he lifted a forkful and looked surprised at the absence of struggle. No grease clinging to metal, no smell of a long journey. He ate and, after a second mouthful, passed the fork without comment to the man beside him. Around them, others opened identical boxes, and an air of quiet concentration settled in, the kind people bring to small work that matters. The junior officer watched the motion and counted absent steps. No cook fire to build. No water to heat. No queue to organize. No person whose entire day turned into stirring and washing. Every minute saved here could be spent on the road, on a repair, on a map. He wrote a note to himself that was not about food at all. Design that reduces coordination is worth more than its weight. A second row of pallets held toolkits nested in metal tins with spring latches that clicked shut with a sound any machine likes. The engineer lieutenant opened one and ran a thumb over the wrenches. Metric on one side, fractional on the other, each stamped, each living in a cutout that matched its outline. He lifted the tray and found a coil of safety wire, pre-cut links in a small tin, pliers with jaws that bit cleanly, a pamphlet showing how to root line around a fitting to keep a nut from walking loose. They assume the person holding this is tired, he said. So they make the decisions in advance. On a makeshift table lay medical rolls sealed in a transparent film that pushed a wave of clean scent into the cold. A medic slid a blade through the seam and unrolled a kit whose compartments were labelled in printing anyone could read even in poor light. Tablets for pain, powder to keep wounds clean, strips of adhesive that held without tearing skin, scissors that cut fibre instead of pushing it. The medic looked up and did not need to say anything. The officer saw it in his face. This is the difference between a long night and a manageable one. A crate of portable heaters stood next, their vent elbows nested in a way that made boxes seem to hold more volume than they physically could. A slim manual sat on top, pictures first, words second. Fuel line here, flue pipe there, keep the elbow clear, don't pitch the tent so close that canvas glosses. The engineer lieutenant pointed at the tiny line that showed clearance in inches and nodded. Someone built this for a person who will glance once and get it right. What struck everyone, even those not inclined to admire, was the scale of sameness. The next box held the same breakfast unit as the first. Another held lunch. Another supper. Cardboard sizes repeated. Labels repeated. Even the gum wrappers folded into identical squares. Sameness is not glamour. It is capacity made visible. You make one thing at a pace industry understands and let distribution create variety. You solve 100 local problems with one decision made far away. The senior officer moved to the fuel corner. Instead of drums, they found 5-gallon cans in ranks, the paint unchipped, the caps tethered so they would not wander. The sidewalls flexed under a knuckle and sprang back, not brittle, not thin. A stack of spouts lay beside them, each with a collar that turned and locked with a half twist. He tried one on a can and the seal bit so cleanly that he imagined pouring without a single wasted drop. He remembered nights with funnels improvised from cut tins and sleeves soaked when a pour went wrong. The memory made him grip the spout a moment longer than necessary. He set it down and breathed in through his nose. In the cool air, even fuel smelled like order. They worked through the rows not as looters but as clerks who understood duty. They wrote what they took and left notes for items they could not carry. The quartermaster set 2 men to strip the wire from splintered pallets and coil it for future repairs. Another squad rescued nails into a coffee can. Nothing obsessive, just the kind of economy that keeps a road lined with quiet advantages. Near the center stood a board with a schedule, times chalked in a hand that belonged to someone used to catching trains. 0900, convoy to West Ridge, food, heaters. 1015, return empty. 1100, medical to Bridge Aid Station. Underneath, a short line, if missed, follow next slot. It was a logistic system built to assume disruption and continue anyway. The arithmetic officer wrote one sentence under it on a scrap of paper he kept for phrases worth remembering. Resilience equals ability to absorb surprise and stay on plan. Not far from the board was a tidy pile of items that did not fit anywhere else. Spare gloves, pencil stubs, a stack of laminated cards with basic radio procedure, 3 small mirrors for signaling, 2 rolls of colored tape. The junior officer flipped a card and read, "Keep messages short. Send location, need, number, time." He smiled despite himself. 4 boxes to tick so that hours and lives were not lost to guesswork. A truck backed in under hand signals, and men formed a chain without being told, each handoff matching the height and rhythm of the last. 8 cans to a layer, 3 layers to a pallet, 2 pallets to a truck, straps over the top, tails tucked so they would not rattle or fray. The work looked like choreography learned by anyone who had ever moved furniture with a neighbor. Feet in the right place, back spared, the lift shared across more than muscle. When they had loaded enough to risk the suspension and not the road, the senior officer called a pause and walked the perimeter one last time. He found, tucked under the trestle table, a small box labeled in a neat hand, "For whoever comes at dusk." Inside, a dozen candles wrapped against damp and a note, "Light only what you need." He lifted one candle, weighed it, and set it down again. "Courtesy travels farther than anger," he said, and surprised himself by saying it aloud. As they prepared to leave, a young private stood with a ration carton in both hands, reading the stamp date. 3 weeks, he said, almost amazed. "They made this 3 weeks ago, and here it is." The senior officer heard him and turned. He could have corrected the numbers. He could have said something about ships and docks and rails and roads. Instead, he simply nodded. The soldier did not need a lecture in supply. He had understood the essential thing. This box had moved from decision to hand without the usual delays of a strained system. That makes confidence. They rolled out at a steady pace, each vehicle spaced like a sentence in a good paragraph. For a while, no one spoke. People chewed quietly, or pocketed a leftover biscuit, or folded a wrapper into the clean geometry of a square to use later as tinder. The engineer lieutenant cracked open the manual for a bridge kit he had found, pictures of trusses going up with minimal tools, pins that slid home with a mallet, decking that locked with its neighbor so gaps did not open. "They've scaled carpentry," he said with appreciation. "They make every person a passable builder." On the far slope, the road tightened into a cut. The wind dropped. The radio hummed twice and then settled. The arithmetic officer flipped his notebook to a fresh page and drew a line that began at the morning's pallets and ended at the next circle on tomorrow's plan. He sketched the bridges they had crossed, the junction where they had chosen the heavier ruts, the interim stop where a chalkboard had replaced an officer. He closed the book and rested his hand on the cover, feeling the faint texture of the cardboard through a glove. Behind him, in the bed of the rear truck, 2 soldiers compared the contents of their pockets. One carried a small spool of safety wire and a folded instruction card. The other had a tin of tablets and a mirror the size of a biscuit. They traded without ceremony. In a world of shortages, sharing had usually meant splitting one item into 2 inferior halves. Here, sharing meant exchanging 2 small specific abilities: hold a nut against vibration, signal across a meadow. The difference felt like sunlight one can't see but notices when it's gone. At the next bend, a low building came into view with a signboard whose letters had been painted with care. Service, 3rd Platoon, Thursday. The date had changed since it was written, but the intent still hung in the air. The convoy did not stop. It did not need to. It carried, in the space behind each seat and under each top, enough of that intent to borrow a few more hours from the day. Night pressed in gently rather than hard, a velvet dim that made the trucks glow faintly where snow dust settled on warm metal. They turned off their headlamps in the cut and rolled on parking lights, amber beads moving through a canyon of dark fur, until the lead scout gave the signal to halt. Ahead, the road narrowed to a 1-lane stone bridge and, beyond that, a crossroads village that had traded hands twice in 2 days. The plan was to pass without delay. The reality was a knot of uncertainty, scattered equipment in the verge, doors ajar, and a chalk arrow on a bakery wall that pointed to aid, 300m. The arrow knew enough that the chalk had not run in the damp. The senior officer sent a pair forward on foot. They returned with news that sounded like contradiction and therefore like the truth. The village was quiet, the bridge intact, and in the square, under a tarpaulin stretched between 2 wagons, a mixed group sheltering from the wind, local civilians, a handful of American medics still working by habit and principle, and 3 German officers who had walked in an hour earlier with hands raised and a request not for quarter but for information. They had been separated from their unit and, seeing the boards and crates and neat lines of empties, had followed the way a thirsty man follows sound to water. The convoy eased into the square at idle. No one hurried. No one slouched. The medic stood, nodded, and kept doing what medics do, checking blankets, setting a splint, making sure a kettle stayed just under simmer. The German officers watched in a manner that was not hostile and not quite neutral. One had the thin, intent face of a mathematics teacher. Another carried himself like a cavalryman displaced by a mechanical sentry. The third, younger, blinked often, a sign of sleeplessness rather than fear. A corporal set a crate on the tailgate and lifted the lid with both thumbs. Cardboard clicked. Inside, the small theatre repeated. Can with a key, biscuits, chocolate, coffee, gum, matches, tissue, a wooden spoon. He handed the box without flourish to the nearest of the three. The officer accepted it with the care one gives an object that might not be real. He turned it, read the stamp date, pursed his lips, and then, with the mild awkwardness of a person performing in front of strangers, unrolled the key and wound the strip of metal cleanly around the can. The lid lifted without complaint. He tasted, paused, not from distrust, but because he had expected to brace himself, and then nodded almost apologetically, as if approving a student's neat solution to a simple problem. He passed the spoon to his companions. The senior officer watched the exchange and did not intrude. He had nothing rhetorical to offer that would improve the moment. Words sometimes reduce what they attempt to praise. The medics, practiced in finding dignity amid shortage, quietly pushed more cartons onto the tailgate. Hands, friend hands, enemy hands, simply human hands, distributed them without bookkeeping. The cold drew statements of steam from cups. Men warmed their fingers on tin. The cavalryman studied the box as if it were an artifact from an advanced culture. He touched the waterproof coating, the crisp edges that had not softened in snow, the tight seam of a packet that yielded when intended and never before. Everything is in its place, he said in serviceable English. The younger officer, after a cautious sip of coffee that asked little and gave much, said nothing at all and looked at the matchbook as if it were a small miracle. The mathematician, eyes on the date again, performed his own silent arithmetic. He glanced at the orderly stacks by the church wall and then at the trucks lined in the lane, tarps tight, straps flat, tailboards latched, and whatever he concluded, it did not require translation. He exhaled and folded the cardboard slowly, trying out the idea that waste is a choice, not an inevitability. On a low table near the fountain sat an open toolkit, the same kind the engineer lieutenant had admired that afternoon. One of the medics had used the safety wire to secure a kettle handle that loosened in the boil. The cavalryman leaned over it. Not to judge, but to learn. He traced a finger along the twist and smiled at the neatness. "You have a way," he said. The engineer, who had been warming his hands nearby, answered, "We have several," and, seeing no harm in giving away wisdom that was entirely practical and not at all secret, showed the man how to twist without fraying, how to lay the wire so that vibration tightens rather than loosens, how to snap the tail cleanly so fingers don't catch. They worked side by side for 2 minutes like neighbors at a fence. A local baker, hand netted under kerchief, appeared in her doorway with a tray that smelled of something simple and sustaining. The medics gestured her in. She set the tray down and withdrew. The younger officer, unthinking, reached to pay with a coin and stopped, embarrassed by the poverty of the gesture. The medic shook his head gently and slid 2 small chocolate bars across the table in exchange. The baker's face opened like a window admitting sun. For a brief, exact moment, the square felt like a market day that had not been bombed out of memory. The senior officer took the mathematician aside. They stood under the tarpaulin where rain ticked like polite applause. The German said, "Our supply is a web. You cut one thread and the whole sags. Yours is, how do you say, pebbles poured into every gap." The officer considered the metaphor and let it stand. "We spread the load," he said. "We simplify the act." He tapped the ration box the other man held. "We put decision at the factory so the road only carries motion." The mathematician nodded at that. "A solved decision travels farther than an instruction," he said, almost to himself. He lifted the gum, weighed it like a scholar contemplating a footnote, and placed it back as if it belonged to the argument rather than to appetite. From the bridge came the hollow thud of boots on stone. A squad approached, Americans returning from the aid station with 2 litters and an economy of words. They saw the scene, read it without confusion, and folded in around the work. One man took a clipboard and began checking boxes with a pencil whose tip had been sharpened with a knife. Another tied a strap with 2 deft flips that turned cord into a reliable lock. The cavalryman, finished with his second spoonful, set the utensil neatly into the box again as if returning a tool to its slot. He looked at the trucks, then at the neat heap of empties stacked for flattening. "We thought you would move everything in great depots," he said. "Like us. Buildings to burn, maps to capture." He gestured to the square with his chin. "This is smaller than our idea, and therefore larger." The convoy could not linger. The bridge admitted 1 vehicle at a time, and the schedule they had inherited from a chalkboard a town away would be someone else's life measured in minutes by morning. The senior officer gave quiet signals. The engineer returned the toolkit to its tray. The medic closed his roll with the ritual 2-palm presses that flattened fabric into obedience. The quartermaster scribbled the customary note. Took 12. Left 20. Straps in bucket. Heaters under bench. He wedged it under a stone where any hand might find it. Before they climbed back into cabs perfumed with canvas and cold fuel, the senior officer offered the mathematician a pencil and a small notebook page. "For the route you plan," he said, "no sarcasm, only the courtesy one professional extends to another." The German drew 2 lines and a crossmark and wrote a word that meant ford, and another that meant cut slope, and a third that meant do not trust the corner. It looks solid and isn't. He handed the page back, then shook his head and tapped his own chest. The officer understood and returned it. Maps travel both ways. Engines turned over with the comfortable baritone of machines tended by people who care. First truck to the bridge, pause at the crown so the rear axle doesn't slap the stone lip, then down into the lane and away. The square shrank behind them to a small lamp under fabric, to 3 figures sitting closer together than before, to a table with fewer boxes and 1 more toolkit with wire tucked neatly inside. In the lead cab, the arithmetic officer opened his notebook and wrote a single sentence to carry forward. Confidence is a supply. He underlined it twice, not out of drama, but to remind himself later that this, too, must be moved in quantity. Confidence that a box opened in the dark will hold what it claims. Confidence that a bridge kit will make strangers into carpenters for an afternoon. Confidence that a candle and a note, light only what you need, can push a cold room 1 degree toward comfort and sanity. They cleared the village without headlights and, once in open fields again, raised the beams. Snow answered with a soft, steady light. The road lifted and fell like a chest asleep. Somewhere to the south, engines idled in a wood, waiting for a fuel truck that would not come. Here, fuel rode in small measures multiplied by habit and planning. In the rear view, the senior officer could still see the square as a geometry exercise solved in chalk. 2 wagons, 1 top, a line of crates, a board with 4 times written clearly. The kind of problem you can hand to a tired person at dusk and trust them to complete. On the hour, the radio came alive with a calm voice that used no adjectives. Location, need, number, time. Another voice answered in the same pattern. There was no romance in it and every kind of grace. The convoy settled into that cadence, a paragraph of moving machines punctuated by bridges and signed by tire tracks that told tomorrow's travelers where tonight's wisdom had gone. Dawn took its time, arriving first as a thin darkness and then as a film of silver brushed over hedges and fences. The convoy reached a ridge where the road bent between 2 old trees, and there the senior officer halted to let the last vehicles close up. The pause felt earned. A field on the left fell away into folded ground. On the right stood a small, square building with heavy timbers and a door that looked older than the map symbols that marked it. Someone once used it to store seed or tools. Today it stored something different, the remainder of a forward supply drop, neatly culled by a detail that had done almost everything right except leave a note. The absence of a note, in a system that loved small certainties, was oddly loud. The quartermaster hopped down, walked a slow circle, and rebuilt the story from evidence. Here a triangle of flattened snow where a crate had rested, there a line of boot prints drifting toward the orchard, each step a small bay of compressed crystals with a telling ridge at the heel. He found a pile of strapping buckles set carefully on a plank, not tossed aside but stacked like coins. He smiled at that. People who understand that small metals can be the difference between tidy and tangled are his kind of people. By the doorframe hung a length of chalk on a string. He rubbed it between finger and thumb, left a rectangle on the wood, and wrote, taken, heaters, 4, candles, 12, cough.
3, bros, 6, wire, 2.
Left, straps, many, buckles, clean, note, this. He weighted the string with a simple knot so the chalk would not bang in the wind and break. They rolled again. Meadows gave way to a low town shaped by a river that could not decide whether to meander or commit. At the edge, a sign half buried in snow said mill in 2 languages, and beyond it, a wide court with a roofed loading dock and a brick wall painted with fading flower advertisements. The place smelled faintly of grain even in winter, a good omen for a group that measured comfort by the scoop. Under the roof stood pallets of empty cans, wash basins, fuel tins, water containers, the blank nouns of supply waiting to be turned into verbs. The engineer lieutenant saw at once what the place could become. He walked the dock, counting tie-down points with his eyes, then paced the doorways and marked them with his glove like a conductor mapping entrances for a new arrangement. Sort wet from dry. Clear a lane from road to rear. Heaters on outer corners to keep a ring of warm air. 1 candle per bin for gentle lift. No open flames near solvent locker, he said, not loudly, but with the tone of a man giving out a list of truths that had worked yesterday and would work tomorrow. A section peeled off to execute. They moved like a practice chorus. 2 to sweep, 2 to stack, 1 to chalk columns on the floor. R, rations. W, water. F, fuel. M, medical. K, kits. T, tools. Clarity is speed. Speed is safety. In the office, the senior officer discovered a ledger bound in cloth, its lines so straight they looked drawn with a ruler. The first entry dated to the last harvest before the war. He turned past pages of barley bought and oats milled to a blank spread and wrote what the new day asked for. Intake, crate 64, outflow, bridge kits 3, fuel tins 18, heaters 8, broth units 12, spare wire 1 reel, tools 1 tray. Sign here to take, sign here to leave, write what you learned. He left the pencil in the spine where any hand could find it. Wordless, the place accepted its new role. A truck backed to the dock and lowered its tailgate. Hands moved cartons to the chalked R. Another truck idled while a mechanic adjusted a strap that sang its small warning at speed. When the note changed to silence, the driver nodded and eased away. A runner slid in, breath white, and asked for 2 cans of water and an extra lantern for a house with a cellar where the wind worked like a siphon. He signed the ledger with a strong slant and departed with thanks that were not so much spoken as carried in the set of his shoulders. Mid-morning, 2 figures arrived on bicycles, coats layered, knees pumping an honest rhythm. They wore armbands that the quartermaster recognized. Local civil helpers who knew every ditch and gate within 10 kilometers. Their map was not paper. It was a memory of fences and footpaths. The older one, cheeks windburned, pointed with his whole hand toward the north fields. Track there, he said in halting English, then added, good ground, if frozen. Bad ground, if noon. The younger one handed over a small burlap sack. In it, 20 clean glass bottles and a coil of cotton wicking. A medic clapped softly. Lamp refills, the sort of gift that turns an aid post from dim to workable. They shared a cup of hot broth in the mill office, steam curling into the pale light. A baker's boy appeared at the door with a woven basket lined in cloth. Inside lay small loaves, dark and dense, the kind that anchor a bowl of soup to a person's day. The quartermaster traded a bottle of condensed milk and 2 paper packets of salt, the exact line where want meets generosity. The boy's eyes widened at the bright printing. He tucked the parcels into his coat as if they were letters from a faraway aunt. On the far side of the mill yard, the engineer set up a demonstration table. 4 items, for motions. He showed 3 local men and the bicycle pair how to lash a box with a common strap so that a single pull frees the load without whipping, how to knot cord so the knot holds under strain and unties with cold fingers, how to place a heater under a bin at the corner nearest a draft, not in the center where heat only warms itself, how to fold a note so that the first line is visible without unfolding, saving time and curiosity in a storm. They practiced. One man misthreaded the buckle and laughed at his own error. The second corrected him without pride. After 15 minutes, they were faster than yesterday's army, and that is the point. Capacity is not rank sensitive. It is teachable. A hush came over the yard as a small column appeared from the south. 3 American trucks with mud up to their axles and, walking alongside, a group of German soldiers carrying their winter on their backs. No weapons, no posture, only the subdued look of people who have learned that forward is the only direction that helps. The lieutenant in charge of the trucks lifted a hand. The senior officer answered. The German non-commissioned leader met them halfway. He had the careful manner of a person choosing each step on thin ice. The meeting took place beside a stack of empties that had become a landmark. The German spoke French-born phrases that landed softly. The American answered with simple English and gestures. So much could have been complicated. Instead, they arranged what needed arranging. Food first, water next, blankets after, then a tidy exchange of information about a bridge upstream that looked sound but wasn't. Ice had crept under one abutment and turned stone into a rumour. The ledger opened again. The German wrote his name slowly, as if each letter cost something and he was willing to pay. Under what you learned, he wrote 3 words in his language that the senior officer later translated as "listen to the wood," a perfect instruction for winter crossings. They ate together without ceremony. The German leader glanced at his men as they opened small tins and crackers and coffee. He examined the wax box with the same discreet respect the mathematician had shown the night before, but he did not linger or praise. He had officer's habits: observe, register, move on. One of his young soldiers, cheeks still teenage, held up a matchbook and smiled at its tiny advertisement, a cartoon kettle with the words, "Keep it just under a boil." The medic, seeing the moment, tapped the matchbook and said, "Always useful," which is as close as anyone came to philosophy before noon. Business resumed. A courier from a neighbouring unit trotted in with a message on onion skin paper, a list of needs with times beside each line: bridge kit, 1,200, water tins, 4, 12.45, lantern, 1,300, broth, 13.15. The quartermaster checked boxes on the ledger and put a dot of chalk on items staged for pickup. Dots bloom into rhythm. Rhythm becomes reliability. In mid-afternoon, a flurry of small setbacks arrived, as they always do in clusters. A strap snapped. A heater refused to light. A crate had been packed with the wrong spoons, too large for the narrow cans. None of it was grand. All of it was corrosive if left alone. The engineer cut new strap lengths from bulk roll and taught a quick splice that holds under tension. The medic cleaned the heat nozzle with the edge of a wooden tag and set it right. The quartermaster broke out a bag of spare utensils and slipped 10 into a side pocket marked odd sizes so that tomorrow's hands will thank today's foresight without knowing whom to thank. This is logistics at its most human. Not grand feats, but the quiet refusal to let trouble stack. Near sunset, the senior officer climbed the mill stairs to the small window that looked west. He could see the road unfurling toward a low line of hills, trucks like commas in a long sentence, pauses that made sense because the sentence was being read well. A church bell in the distance marked the hour with restraint. He thumbed the pencil and wrote the day's brief in his notebook. We turned a mill into a depot by naming corners and choosing habits. We traded within the commons: salt for bread, milk for glass, wire for knowledge. We learned a bridger's voice from a stranger's 3 words. We replaced a note that should have been there with one that is. Down in the yard, the bicycle pair checked their lights. The older man looked up and raised 2 fingers in a plain salute. Not martial, simply appreciative. The senior officer returned it, then headed back to the floor where the last tasks always wait, sweeping the chalk dust that gets under boots and makes the next step slip a little, stacking the empty square so wind cannot turn them into instruments, tying one short length of cord to the ledger's pencil so the tool is always where the task needs it. Dark gathered cleanly. They hung one lantern high and one low. Highs prevent stumbling, lows show edges. The mill door closed on hinges that sighed a little and then settled. Trucks formed up in tours. A medic handed the ledger to the quartermaster, who slid it into a canvas satchel with a map and a tin of spare graphite leads. The engineer clapped his gloves twice to knock off flour and snow, then tucked them under his belt so they would be warm when needed. As the first pair rolled out, the radio carried a fragment from the unit they had helped at dawn. A calm voice, a little less tired than before. Bridge held. Heaters worked. Thank you for the wire. No names, no flourish. The senior officer kept his eyes on the track and let the sentence take up its correct space inside him. He did not collect such thanks. He filed them like receipts, proof that a simple plan, repeated, pays its own costs. The convoy took the right fork toward a valley where a rail line ran like a low seam. Ahead waited more squares to be relabeled, more corners to be named, more notes to be folded with the first line visible. Behind them, in a building that once weighed grain, the air held a faint warmth long after the last heel left the floor. On the office table, the ledger lay ready for the next hand, open to a half-filled page under the heading that both humbled and steadied: Write what you learned. Night travel reorders the world. Distances change shape, sounds grow taller, and small instruments become companions you trust more than your own eyes. The convoy slipped into the valley where the rail line drew a dark underline across pale fields. A thin crust had formed on the snow. Tires cracked it with a soft, steady rhythm that made conversation optional. From time to time, the radio muttered a bearing or a caution, and the column adjusted by inches rather than yards. In logistics, elegance is rarely visible. It's felt in the absence of stumbles. They halted near a low embankment where the tracks curved toward a siding and a squat brick depot with a dented tin roof. The place had been busy once. You could tell by the number of doors. Now it held only a remnant, a guard's chair, a telegraph table without a key, a broom hung by its handle as if it might be needed on short notice. The quartermaster stepped inside, lifted the broom down, and swept the threshold in 3 strokes. "Clean edges make clean thoughts," he said to no one in particular, and set his satchel on the table. They were not alone. A railway man with a wool cap and a scarf tucked tight under his chin came from a side room, palms visible, eyes wary but practical. He had the look of someone who had been in charge of other people's waiting for a very long time. The senior officer offered a greeting, the kind that spells a person's name carefully the first time. The railway man answered with a neat nod and a key, laying it on the table between them like an introduction. "Back shed," he said, and motioned toward the siding. The shed was better than expected. Dry floor, a window that faced away from the wind, and racking that once held spare couplers and oil cans. Now it held a surprise the railway man had not known how to count: bundles of coarse cloth, the sort used to wrap bales, and a stack of wooden slats banded in wire. The engineer grinned. "Crating," he said. "We are always short on minutes. This buys us some." They set 2 lanterns at opposite corners and turned the shed into a packing line. Slats became sleeves. Cloth became cushion. The empty spaces between irregular items, stovepipes, lantern globes, boxes of mixed hardware, were made honest by the simple act of fitting wood to shape. When a box closes cleanly, a road opens. A runner brought a problem with the crispness of one who respects other people's time. Flooded span 2 kilometers east. Not deep, but cold and fast. We can wade it with poles. We'll lose half an hour and feeling in our shins. The engineer listened, drew a rectangle on a scrap, and wrote 4 short steps: stake, plank, rope, rhythm. He handed the scrap to the runner and spoke as if calling out steps to music. Drive 2 stakes upstream, 1 downstream as a catch. Lay planks perpendicular to the flow. Lash at the corners, not the middles. Put a guide rope waist high, not ankle high. Cross 1 at a time, starting with the heaviest to test the song of the structure. If the song sours, pause, adjust, continue. The runner read it twice, folded the paper in half so the first line was visible, and left with the pace of a man who had just traded uncertainty for instructions. Back in the depot, the senior officer opened the ledger to a fresh page and wrote a heading: Railside Collection Point. He drew 2 columns, Arrived and Sent, and a smaller one titled Notes That Matter Later. He had learned that last column the hard way. Memory gets generous with itself by morning. Under Arrive he listed: crating slats 28 bundles, bale cloth 16, lamp oil 2 tins, spares, mixed, 1 tray. Under Sent he would later write: bridge mats 3, food tins 24, gloves 18 pair, spare laces 30. He left the pencil where hands could find it and stepped aside. Ledger space is a kind of currency. You spend it to buy clarity for the next group. The medic set up a corner with a kettle, a ladle, and a tin cup that had been burnished by 1,000 rinses. He laid out his small items on a folded towel: thermometer, bandages, salve, a roll of paper labels, a stub of soft pencil, then marked the wall at the level of his elbow. "Things creep down when we are tired," he said. "I keep them up where my habits live." A young driver came in, knuckles red, fingertip split at the nail from a strap mishap. The medic cleaned and sealed it and made a note on the label roll: strap tray needs gloves on top, then went and did exactly that, because instruction without the matching act is theatre. Around midnight, a low whistle from the outer picket brought them to the yard. 2 figures moved along the fence line in a way that stated plainly: invited. The bicycle pair had returned, this time with a 3rd companion, small, alert, carrying a carpenter's bag. He did not waste their time with introductions beyond a nod. He went straight to the broken timber pile by the siding, knelt, and sorted pieces by grain and straightness, not by length. "Strength first," he said, almost to himself. Within 20 minutes he'd built 2 sleds from scrap, runners waxed with candle ends, crossbars pegged and lashed, a pull rope threaded through the front plank so it would not saw the wood under strain. He stood, wiped his hands on his trousers, and let the sleds speak for themselves when a crate slid onto one and glided as if the ground had been waiting for exactly that shape. They gave him a coil of stiff wire and a tin of nails not because he asked, but because the day had a ledger for fairness as well. The radio hissed with a weather line: a band of thickening fog rising from the river and spilling along low ground. Fog humbles plans that rely on lanes and landmarks. The senior officer chose, as he usually did, to shrink the problem instead of argue with it. He split the convoy. 6 vehicles would stay to help the railside point home in the morning, for would ease on to a hill village where a road crossed an old green with drainage ditches like seams in a coat. He sent the engineer forward with the smaller group and kept the quartermaster and medic with the point. 2 kinds of pace, he said. Both count. The hill road leaned upward from a valley, a steady grade that turned engines into metronomes. At a bend, they found the flooded span. The runner's crew had already worked the plan. Stakes in, planks lashed, rope snug at the waist, the structure singing a quiet, steady note felt through boot soles. The engineer tested the first step as if onto a dance floor. The planks flexed, then held. The rope hummed, not too tight, not too loose. One by one, the vehicles crossed, slow, deliberate, guided by hand signals that were economy itself. A single raised palm meant pause. 2 short circles meant ease forward. A forearm across the chest meant stop now. Not one shout, not one flourish. On the far bank, the engineer thanked the crew with the sort of handshake that adds a moment to a long night. He left them a heater and a bag with a thermos, 3 cups, and a paper packet of tea. Return the thermos tomorrow, he said with a grin that implied trust and certainty equally. They would. The village announced itself by smell before sight, with smoke, yeast, damp wool. Fog made halos of the street lamps. The old green wore a new white. In the center stood a pump under a small roof. The engineer walked to it and laid his palm on the iron. Cold, solid, dependable. He marked 4 squares on the green with small stakes and twine. Receiving, staging, warming, and outflow. And then he and his 2 drivers became a moving crew. In 30 minutes, a place that had been simply a pause point became a functioning node. Empty tins lined and numbered. Food and fuel separated like siblings who get along better when not asked to share a toy. A hand-lettered sign on the pump house. Trade here. Bottles for fuel, notes for wire, help for heat. People came. The baker sent a daughter with a basket of yesterday's bread. She insisted on trading for salt, then immediately used a pinch to tame the pump house's icy step. A teacher brought a slate she had wiped clean and offered it for the signboard. With neat chalk, she wrote the hours and the rules. Short line, quick hands. Say what you need. Take what you'll use. Leave what helps the next. 2 older men, coats buttoned high, took charge of the warming corner, arranging benches so legs weren't in pathways. Hanging mittens on a cord to dry, creating the tiny, dignified order that turns waiting into resting. At the railside point, a different sort of order grew. The quartermaster laid out an oddments table, things that don't belong anywhere until suddenly they belong exactly somewhere. 2 left-handed can openers, for lengths of hinge, 3 bolts that match nothing today, a folded map of roads that no longer exist, 6 corks with good thread, a spool of black thread that isn't wire but behaves like it under light duty. He set a small note beside it. Trade a story for 1 oddment. By dawn, the table held fewer objects and the ledger held 3 crisp entries that would save somebody a long detour weeks from now. Near 3 in the morning, a small event stitched the 2 nodes together. The radio crackled with a request from the hill green for lantern mantles, those delicate sleeves that turn a small flame into a generous light. The railside point had 6 in a tin tobacco box. The quartermaster paused, weighed, and decided the mathematics of kindness favored motion. He sent a courier on the carpenter's sled, rope across his chest like a bandolier, mantles and a cloth bag inside his coat to keep them from the brittle air. 2 hours later, the sled returned with the same bag, now carrying 3 clean lamp chimneys and a folded note. We mended your cracked glass. We took your mantles. We left you light. The ledger's notes that matter later received the sentence intact. Dawn shortened the fog into separate pieces that rose and drifted away like conversation concluding without rancour. The engineers group loaded the last crates, lifted the last little hands off the warming bench to give them back to their families, and pulled the stakes in the green, leaving only the chalk lines on the pump house and the rules on the slate. The quartermaster's group closed the shed door and tied the broom to its hook with a loop that would slide but not clamp. They rejoined at the ridge where hedges made a tidy seam against the sky. The vehicles lined up not because a rule demanded it but because habit does. The senior officer took the ledger, ran his eye down the night's trades, and felt the rare calm that comes when numbers and needs agree. He drew a single line under the last entry, not to finish the work. Work never finishes, but to say, this portion holds. Before they moved, He looked at his small team and said what he saved for mornings when the ground had been cooperative. We made the map wider without making the roads longer. Then he pointed his hand toward the next valley, where a factory roof sawtoothed the horizon and a yard full of pallets waited to be convinced into usefulness. The convoy rolled, carrying forward the unremarkable miracles that keep movements from turning into monuments to regret: lantern mantles, sled runners, a broom that finds a purpose again, a ledger with room left on the page for the next set of clear words. The factory yard presented itself as a puzzle dumped from a generous box, pallets leaning like books without shelves, barrels with chalk marks that meant something to someone last week, spools of cable nesting beside crates stenciled with destinations that had changed twice since sunrise. A breeze lifted paper tags and set them down again a few feet to the left, as if to remind everyone that information wanders when it isn't anchored. They parked in a shallow L against a brick wall warmed by a coal stove somewhere inside. The senior officer looked not at the volume of material but at the paths between things. "We don't move goods," he said, drawing an invisible line from gate to loading dock. "We move decision points closer together." The engineer, already halfway up a stack of pallets, waved a gloved hand. "We'll need lanes in fours. Lift, prep, verify, go." The quartermaster put the ledger on a makeshift desk, 2 crates and a plank that had been a door in a previous life, and printed a new heading: Pallet Yard, Throughput by Lanes. They started with sound. The carpenter, who had come along for this segment, walked the perimeter tapping boards and barrel hoops with a short mallet, listening for the dull report that indicates waterlogged wood and the brighter note that says reliable. He chalked a check on the strong ones and an R on those that wanted rest, then turned 3 S into 2 checks by adding a plank and a brace in the right place. Conservation measured not by saving everything, but by making the right things ready. A yard foreman appeared with a knit cap and the posture of a man who sleeps lightly. He had a clipboard, a pencil worn to its last sensible inch, and the quiet smile of someone who appreciates any help that arrives with its own plan. "We had a way," he said, a little rueful. Then the line of trucks doubled back on itself and the way became a knot. The senior officer pointed to the chalked lanes. "We'll make a bow out of it." The foreman laughed once, short, honest, then fetched a gang of 6 who knew where the splinters hide. First, they standardized the base. Pallets were sorted by footprint so that stacks would behave like stacks, not piles with opinions. The engineer laid a measuring stick across the best of them, marking A for true, B for salvageable with a shim, and C for kindling. The carpenter turned the BS toward AS with wedge slivers shaved from the CS. Waste became fit in the space of an hour. You could feel morale lift with the stacks. A yard that looks squared tends to behave squared. Then they taught the yard a new rhythm. Each lane got a pair, a picker and a confirmer. The picker's job was to assemble requirements by list. The confirmer's job was to make the list match what sat on wood. They spoke in the shorthand of people who have traded accuracy for speed before and regretted it. Green cord, not grey. 2 tins per, not 3. Check the tally against the chalk, not the label. The ledger gained a margin note in neat pencil. We save time by assuming nothing. A small crisis arrived disguised as abundance. 2 trucks brought barrels of lamp oil that smelled like anything but. The medic fetched a dropper, placed a bead on a scrap, and held a flame nearby. It bloomed too quickly, too hot. He wrote stove only on both heads in large script, tied red cloth through the bungs, and moved the barrels to a separate square. "The difference between almost right and right is the difference between a warm room and a burned one," he said softly, and someone closest to the line quietly moved the water bucket closer to the trouble square. By midday, the lane sang. A truck nosed in, a checker matched it, a team built its load like a sentence with a verb, and the gate counted the syllables as wheels rolled past. The foreman's clipboard started to look like a ledger in its own right. Times, quantities, destinations, tiny arrows showing what learned from what. He looked at the senior officer as a man looks at a map he did not draw but now trusts. "We can double," he said, surprised and pleased. "We will," came the answer, not boastful, simply descriptive. A train whistle sounded from the siding, a low, practical note. The railway man from the night before had brought a short consist, 2 flats, a boxcar, and a brake van that had stories etched into its paint. 2 hours, he said. Maybe less if the dispatch gods smile. The engineer took the news as a gift and a deadline. He pointed at the flats. Odd loads first, because certainty loads itself. They guided a crate the size of a small room onto dunnage like easing a piano through a doorway. Wedges went in, straps went over, and a chalk diagram on the crate's side turned into reality within the space of 5 quiet instructions. In a corner of the yard, a table appeared that had not been there in the morning. On it, the quartermaster laid 5 K-Ration sleeves, the little waterproof bricks that had started arguments and ended them since the first box found its way into a hungry hand. He opened one with the gentle attention one gives to simple truths: crackers wrapped tight, a can with a key that promised more than calories, a folded card with printed instructions for making a hot drink where hot water was a luxury and time even more so. The foreman watched, chewing thoughtfully on an imaginary pencil. "They put matches in the box," he said, half to himself. "They plan for wet pockets." The quartermaster nodded. "They plan for mornings when you don't get to choose your weather." A group of drivers took their break near the table. One picked up the little wooden spoon, balanced it on a finger, then tucked it behind the paper band that had kept the crackers orderly. "They spent thought on something that weighs less than a breath," she said, smiling. "Feels like being treated as if I matter in places no one can see." No one replied because no reply could add improvement to what she had just stated. Fog pulled again in low spots after a brief thaw, and with it came a visitor who carried his authority like a careful tool. He wore a band on his arm with a red cross and a ledger of his own, thinner but no less serious. "Field station up the road," he said. "We are short on simple things that make other things possible: basins, clean cloth, cups that won't crack when hot liquid meets cold air." The medic looked around, pointed to a stack of enamel basins under top, counted out cloth rolls from the salvage table, and added 2 kettles, each with a stout handle and a lid that fit properly. He tied tags to each piece with the field station's direction and a small line: "Return what survives use. No ceremony if it does not." They built a compact load on a small cart, the kind 2 people can guide with ropes. The carpenter rubbed a bar of soap along the runners for glide, and the driver who had admired the spoon stepped forward to take one of the ropes. "I'll go," she said simply. The engineer offered a route drawn in pencil on a scrap and a coin-sized compass that had ridden on his watchband since before he had grey in his beard. "Follow the fence until the road stops pretending to be a road," he said. "Then trust the slope. When the air smells like bleach and boiled cloth, you're there." She nodded, tucked the compass under her sleeve, and set off with the medic's quiet blessing: "Keep your pace, not the fog's." While she disappeared into the pale, the yard delivered a different sort of problem: labels that lied. 2 crates insisted they held fasteners. The weight said otherwise. The quartermaster pried one open and revealed wool blankets, folded with a ship's pride. Someone somewhere had made a switch to solve a yesterday problem, and today's paperwork had not caught up. The foreman winced. "I turned away a unit this morning that needed these. I sent them to the next yard for fasteners I believed we had." The senior officer didn't scold. He wrote a single line in the ledger: "When truss breaks, repair immediately." Then he sent the radio's youngest operator after the unit with a sled and 2 blankets rolled tight, plus a note to the next yard: "We owe you 6 crates of bolts. We are good for them. Send your runner back with a time." The operator left with the equal parts dread and pride that attached to an errand important enough to rebalance a morning. By late afternoon, the cart team returned from the field station. Lighter by basins and cloth, heavier by news. They converted an old schoolroom, the driver said, warming her hands at a stove now burning the properly labelled fuel. Chalkboard holds a list longer than arms. The kettle lids fit. The cups did not crack. They asked for string next time and anything with a spout. The medic wrote spouts on his palm with a pencil stub and underlined it twice. The engineer took the compass back, wiped its face with a thumb, and said nothing except with his eyes, which said thank you well enough. The train took the flats on time, the boxcar 10 minutes early, and the brake van exactly when it meant to. The railway man tipped his cap in a way that included everyone. "You made your own schedule," he said, almost admiring. "That makes mine easier to keep." The senior officer watched the cars pull away, straps humming in small voices, wedges snug like punctuation at the end of a paragraph that had taken all day to write. Twilight arrived as a question: continue under lanterns or hold the line you've drawn and protect it with rest? The yard foreman, now on his 2nd pencil and 5th page, recommended a pause that felt like wisdom rather than retreat. "The map in my head says we've moved tomorrow closer by an hour," he said. "If we press now, we'll spend that hour finding what we put down in the dark." The senior officer agreed. He closed the ledger not with finality but with care, slid the pencil under the string that kept pages honest, and set a small wrap suite on top, a habit he had acquired after realizing that ending a shift with something small and certain teachers hands to return to the work with steadier purpose. Before they rolled, the quartermaster walked the yard one last time, tucking tags under twine, writing a leaning stack, leaving a note where a note would save a question. He paused at the K-Ration sleeves, now 2 instead of 5, and left a simple card in their place, planned for wet pockets. He didn't sign it. Such things sign themselves when they are true. They climbed in, engines blinking awake one by one like patient animals, and pointed their noses toward a river town where bridge needed lanes improvised and a ferrymaster needed convincing that schedules are not laws but agreements between reasonable parties. As the convoy eased out, the carpenter jogged alongside to hand the engineer a small wrapped bundle. 4 spouts he had carved from offcuts, sanded smooth, drilled true. "For the list," he said. The engineer weighed one in his palm and smiled. "The list breathes," he answered. "We keep giving it lungs." Night did its usual trick of making the world smaller and the work larger, but the cab windows held little rectangles of assurance, lamps steady, hands on wheels, radios murmuring, thermoses passing between seats in the small ceremony of shared warmth. Somewhere behind them a yard was no longer a knot. Somewhere ahead a bridge would become less of a barrier. In between rolled a proof too ordinary to frame, that when abundance meets organization, distances shrink, and when small kindnesses are standardized into the plan, tomorrow arrives with fewer sharp edges. The river town announced itself with the smell of damp rope and old timber. Dock pilings leaned like elders swapping stories, gulls wrote punctuation over the water, and a ferry bell rang with the modest confidence of a tool that has worked for generations. The convoy eased down the slope in low gear, brakes murmuring, radios counting quietly to themselves, 2 lengths, 1 length, stop. Lanterns along the quay made small constellations on puddles that forgot to freeze. The ferrymaster came out of a shack with notebook, scarf, and a gaze that measured weights the way a violinist hears pitch. He shook the senior officer's hand. "You brought your own patience," he said, half greeting, half approval. "We'll trade mine for yours." The engineer unfolded a rough plan on the ferry's deck, axle spacing chalked as if the planks were a blackboard, curb marks translated into rope knots. The ferrymaster watched, then drew a single X where he wanted a truck's heaviest corner. "I've learned to speak plank," he said. "It answers back if you listen." They loaded in a rhythm that felt like breathing. 2 trucks aboard, engines off, chocks in place, straps belly tight to rings that had seen more winters than anyone on deck. The ferrymaster signaled with a palm. The river answered with a shove that felt friendly but firm. On the far bank, lanterns matched those behind, as if someone had held up a mirror and invited the convoy to step through. Under a canvas awning, 3 prisoners sat on a bench, officers by posture and age, wool coats without insignia, an interpreter standing near the doorway the way a bookmark stands by a page. They had been helping the river police mark channels with painted stakes, work that demanded attention but not opinion. The quartermaster approached with a wooden crate and a professional courtesy that did not change with uniforms. "You'll be crossing after we clear the approach," he told the river police. "Your passengers should eat before the wind finds their bones again." He set the crate on a barrel head, opened it, and laid out individual meal boxes like tiles, brown sleeves, waxed edges, tidy stencils. One of the officers, hair silver at the temples, gloves mended so neatly the men's were proud, watched as the quartermaster broke the paper band and lifted the lid. He seemed to recognize the ritual, or perhaps the care behind it. The interpreter supplied the words gently. He asks, "Are they all like this?" The quartermaster nodded. "Enough to make a habit of it." The officer accepted a box with a nod meant for the idea as much as the object. He pulled the key from a can's lid, wound it carefully as if tuning a music box, and tasted with the caution of a person who has learned that promises sometimes arrive with conditions. Surprise softened his face first, then something harder to name, a calculation ending in an answer he didn't enjoy but respected. He touched the packet with matches. He lifted the folded spoon. "Even the small things," the interpreter translated. The officer did not add more. He didn't need to. Work resumed. The bridge beyond the ferry landing had lost one span to winter ice 2 seasons ago and gained a makeshift one from planks, timbers, and nerve. Locals called it the careful crossing. The engineer walked it with a carpenter's hammer and a medic's caution, tapping joints, reading echoes. He marked risers for brace blocks, sketched a plan that added 2 trestles and a lattice of rope stays. "We make slow strong," he said, as if answering a question that hadn't been asked. A team unrolled rope the color of tea and twice as trustworthy. They cut wedges from sound timber, set them where vibration had begun to write its own story in the boards, and made the deck a conversation among pieces that agreed to carry together. A tractor from the sawmill sputtered into life. The ferrymaster contributed a block and tackle that had lifted anchors and sacks of grain, and once, according to a story the rope did not deny, a piano. In less than an hour, the careful crossing looked less like an apology and more like a plan. On the town square above the river, a schoolhouse had become a distribution room. Maps lived where an alphabet had. Coat hooks now held clipboards, and a bell that used to call lessons now marked departures. A chalk line on the floor separated ask from have, not to create distance but to let eyes settle on progress without tripping over need. The driver who had carried basins to the field station earlier set a metal pot on a brazier, water singing against tin. The small carved spouts the carpenter had sent now returned as part of a system, kettles telling cups exactly where to be, no waste, no burns, no guessing. Requests stacked themselves into a tidy ledger: string, strong, not clever, wire, soft, boots, size honest, chalk, any color, but white writes fastest. The quartermaster read the column with the expression of someone scanning a score he already hears, then pointed. We can fill 3 now, start 2, and promise the rest without lying. The clerk wrote promise beside 2 lines and underlined it once. In that room the word did not mean maybe. It meant count on a thing you can't yet see. By mid-evening, the convoy had become a wheel instead of a line. Trucks crossed, unloaded, circled, and returned for more. The ferry took on and let off like a lung. The engineer and ferrymaster traded nods that contained both gratitude and professional criticism of each other's knots. At the edge of the square, a boy watched with the practical interest of someone piecing together a future. He pointed at the stencil on a wooden crate, arrows, numbers, a destination code, and asked in a whisper if the marks were a language. Yes, the carpenter answered, handing him a stub of chalk. And we are all learning to write it better. Around the time when fatigue usually starts asking for shortcuts, the senior officer called a pause not for rest but for alignment. He gathered the ferrymaster, the yard foreman who had come along to see the bridge, the medic, the engineer, and the quartermaster around a crate turntable. On it, a single page with 10 lines, which he read aloud slowly, one by one, as if adjusting instruments on a panel. Confirm what labels claim. Count by hands, not hope. Shorten paths, widen lanes. Remove opinion from weight. Teach the system to work without heroes. Save heroes for weather. Build return loops for empties. Let packaging do double duty. Design for wet pockets, cold fingers, tired eyes. Move decision points to where noise is lowest. Trade speed for certainty only once per task, not twice. Let small kindnesses be standard procedure, not exceptions. Publish promises. Keep nearly all, explain the few. End shifts with a truth that fits in a pocket. When he finished, no one clapped. This was not that kind of room, but everyone looked a little taller, as if something inside their posture had decided to carry part of the weight. The quartermaster slid a wrapped sweet to the ferrymaster, who pretended surprise and then carefully did not eat it yet. Pocket truth, he said. I'll spend it when the weather frowns. Back at the quay, the 3 officers on the bench had finished their boxes. The interpreter returned with a small request almost too modest to voice. They ask if the wrappers may be kept. For the pockets. The quartermaster smiled, folded one sleeve into a neat rectangle, and handed it back with 2 dry matches wrapped inside. Some days, he said, fire is information. The officer nodded once, as a colleague might when learning a better technique. A whistle from the far bank nudged the night. The last ferry run took on tools, 3 empty barrels flagged for return, and a bundle of rope now shorter but stronger. The ferrymaster waited until the lines thrummed just so, then stepped to the wheel with the ease of a craftsman closing a drawer he built himself. We are not early, he said, eyes on the channel, but neither are we late. We are exact for what mattered. Snow began lightly, each flake an annotation that landed where it could help. The bridge held, the schoolhouse lights glowed steady without drama, and the yard on the far bank had already learned the lanes that made tomorrow less mysterious. The convoy lined up for the road north, not triumphant. Logistics is not a theatre for triumph, but satisfied the way a well-made tool fits the hand. At the cab stepped the driver who, like the little spoons, paused, looking back over the square. She tapped the compass on her wrist, as if thanking it for directions it would give again without complaint, then climbed in and slid the thermos to her partner. Spouts worked, she said. So did the promise. The partner nodded toward the schoolhouse window where a kettle tipped and poured like a quiet ceremony. It always does, he answered, when it's made out of people instead of paper. The engines came alive in a soft chorus. The first truck rolled, the second tucked in, the rest followed at courteous intervals. As the line found the road center, the senior officer closed his ledger and slipped into the seat beside the engineer. He did not look back. He didn't need to. The measure of the day sat in movement, not memory. Behind them, 3 officers on a bench folded wax paper into their pockets with an attention that made the gesture feel like study, not souvenir. One spoke to the interpreter in a voice that carried no bitterness, only a recognition as clear as a bell over water. The interpreter translated quietly, almost to himself. They thought of everything, he said. The convoy's taillights thinned into the snowfall until red became rose and rose became the same winter white that covers fields when they have done their work. Ahead, another depot would ask another set of questions and offer some answers back. The list in the senior officer's pocket breathed. The road made room.